The Spin-Off Podcast Network. Skinny are helping you show how smart you are with the 1Q quiz, an all-new, super challenging and super quick daily quiz built by the Spin-Off. Every Monday, Skinny are giving you the chance to prove you're smart with the Skinny Extra Credit question. Get it right, and you'll get the chance to score yourself some Skinny Extra mobile credit, so you can text, call, or even video call your group chat and gloat about how big your brain is. T's and C's apply.
The Fold is brought to you by O-Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Nau mai, hoki mai ki a The Fold, e mihi nei, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. My guest today is Simon Denny, who is, I was talking to a friend at basketball this morning who's well placed to know about this stuff, who said that he is probably New Zealand's most sort of successful or internationally successful living artist. So this very much is in that kind of periodic What Even Is media series that I run on this podcast. Because I do think, like, what is art if not the original mass media? It's these are objects that are scrutinized by, ideally by a lot of people and who try and figure out what they're trying to say. Simon's a guy who I've got a lot of mutual friends with, but had never actually met until this morning when he came up to our studio. He lives in Berlin, even though he's from Auckland. We actually went to the same school, which will be sort of sick making for some of you. Nothing I can do about that. But I admire the way that he goes about his work. There's this sort of frisky, curious, ambivalent nature of it, and just an extremely ambitious approach to the sort of scale, complexity, the thinking that it involves. His biography, or a line from it, which came through his gallerist Michael Lett, says that he's an artist whose work explores the cultures and values behind some of the new technologies that are changing the world. That, in a sentence, summarizes a lot of what I'm interested in too, and what we touch on sometimes with The Fold. Denny uses art to explore it rather than journalism. And while I get stressed out even thinking about art sometimes, I read this essay in this book called Air Guitar a few years ago, which compared art to basketball, forgive me this aside, and talked about that one of them was an obscure pursuit in sparsely attended halls at the start of the 20th century, and the other was this sort of giant mass spectacle that impacted the world, and that those two situations had essentially inverted themselves by the end of the 20th century, because one of them focused on rules, changing the rules to make it more accessible, whereas the other imposed rules to make it less accessible. I'm sure you could pick a million holes in that thesis, but there seemed to be something in how approachable art and basketball were variously to mass audiences. I hope I'm not being overly reductive to Walt Hickey's argument there. But I feel like the point is that I feel like what Simon's doing is almost the opposite. It is trying to take these huge sort of tectonic shifts in society that are being prompted by technology and drilling deep into them and then exploding them in a way that makes them objects of mass fascination. So look, that's basically the theories that we explore. It's a really big long conversation about technology and how it informs his art and the kind of really original and ambitious thinking that involves. Goes through some of his big works that involve people like Peter Thiel, the sort of investor, libertarian, Bitcoin maxer, who's also a New Zealand citizen, Kim.com, and particularly his new work, Optimism, which opens today at the Auckland Art Gallery and involves, it's sort of based on or jumps off from some patents filed by Rocket Lab and the various kind of modern sort of techno-utopian sort of space-steading kind of worlds that are visible through that. It's heady stuff, but I think if you listen, you'll find this actually very accessible. I think, and Simon's enthusiasm and level of knowledge and just deep fascination is really palpable in this talk. So, yeah, really, really enjoyed this one. Bit of a left turn, but I think there's a lot in it. So, yeah, this is Simon Denny on The Fold. Kia ora, Simon. Welcome to The Fold.
Kia ora.
I'm really excited to get into all this. I wondered if you could start, though, by kind of thinking way back to when you first started being interested in technology and thinking about how you could incorporate it into your practice.
Yeah, so I'm an artist. I grew up in Auckland, but I live in Germany, and that's kind of connected to my interest in technology, believe it or not, because I moved away to go to art school for the second time. I first went to the University of Auckland, and then I moved away in 2007 to go to Germany to study art again. And when I did that, 2007 was an important year for consumer tech because it was the birth of mobile with the launch of the iPhone. And I took just one not so great laptop with me and not very many clothes when I moved away. And I found that my laptop was the most important item that I had in my whole life. And I was keeping in touch with friends on social. I was on MySpace a lot more than I had been previous to that. And I was watching movies on there, consoling myself, with the dead time that I suddenly found myself with being away from friends. And but then I was also learning and researching and doing like art-related stuff on there. And suddenly I was like, what the hell is going on? I'm so obsessed with this object. And then I ran into some people who were studying at the same school at the same time. And they were all really interested in technology and technologists. And I started to think more about who was making this object and why they made it and why I could do this and not that. And that was kind of the beginning of rolling things into my practice. I started looking backwards at artists and how they worked with technology in other moments, as well as the peers that I'd met, like what they were doing. So I started to look at artists that had worked on the internet when the internet first came up, like web-based, browser-based art, and then also like TV art, which was really interesting, like art that was made in the 60s, 70s, and 80s for broadcast television, like specifically as like broadcast as a medium. And then earlier and earlier, like modernism is like full of, stories of artists grappling with how it feels to use technology as it emerges,
I mean, and because as you just pointed out, there's a sort of a lineage of artists wrestling with technology, but at the same time, it did feel like you were early to recognize that the technology, or particularly the sort of technology enabled by the internet, was going to be the kind of consuming socio-cultural, political factor of our lifetimes. And I'm kind of curious about how the art world responded to that. You almost placed a career-sized bet on that in a way.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, it was like, as I say, kind of 2007 onwards was a bit of an inflection point because for those of us who like to periodize things, that was the beginning of a kind of second generation of the consumer
2.0.
web. Web 2, exactly. So social web, user-generated content, and that type of thing was like just starting to be really important. And like Google was suddenly everybody was looking at images through Google. And I just was like, it was affecting all of my peers so much directly that I was just like, yeah, there's so much here. But yeah, I mean, it wasn't, there's an interesting history of art, if I can be very broad about it, where artists have been dealing with media for a long time and new media. And there was a moment in the 70s where that kind of broke off into a kind of subgenre of art called new media art. And there was like a whole kind of history made from there, but it wasn't kind of the mainstream art anymore. And the mainstream art world, if I can, categorize it like that, tended to shy away a little bit from looking at new media and new platforms. And I think the Web 2.0 moment was a moment when that kind of traditional art world couldn't look away anymore. They were clearly selling JPEGs through emails. The commercial world was changing. And also like your social media profile was just so important to your stature among peers and friends. And it was clear that they had a relationship to like how you communicated your work as well. So I think there was a bit of an inflection point, but yeah, there was also some tensions,
Huge amount of tensions. Yeah. And that feels like where you have kind of built your your whole, you at least spent the last 15 years kind of exploring those tensions. And even as you're talking, it feels like you're sort of nodding at the fact that these things aren't easily reduced into a binary of this is good or this is bad, which is a big part of what has made technology so sort of hard to deal with for the rest of us, because we're used to, I think, dealing with this kind of or simplifying things, and this is almost like the most complex and hard to simplify element to it. And what you described in terms of artists selling art as JPEGs via email, which how did the sort of reducing art to something that can be kind of infinitely replicated and traded, how did the art world, from your sort of position, respond to that as a sort of a fundamental bedrock of that digital economy?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, at that time, email was the big kind of late game changer to the art profession, right? Instead of walking into a gallery and buying something, if that was the main way that people came into contact with work, very small shops with very passionate people running them. Now those passionate people were sending emails with JPEGs in them, images of work rather than work itself, and so that just changed the scale of things, of how it was, how things were sold. And then at the same time, art fairs were becoming a really big deal, and that was a place where sort of a one-stop shop, kind of a trade fair environment. These things had both existed for a long time, selling art and photographs and letters had existed for a while, and also art fairs actually started in the 60s and 70s as well. But there was a kind of a velocity that was reached in that Web 2.0 moment, when it was kind of clearly the main way that things were happening in a different way. And then that later accelerated into Web 3 and this kind of much more direct, literally selling JPEGs as art, which I think happened in the last 5 years, where there was this NFT boom, right? And that was something else again.
Yeah, can we talk about that? Because I personally found that a really interesting moment, and that there was sort of a complexity to it that was extremely reduced by the sort of sneering caricature of how it was framed at times.
Yeah,
because the fundamental of the idea that if we're going to move our whole society online, it would be cool if there was a way of compensating artists for creating their work as they move into that environment. That didn't seem so offensive to me, even though that was the general global response. I wondered if you could talk about your reaction to it, because you also participated in a way that, as is typical for you, contained a sort of an ambivalence, or at least a kind of some good jokes about technology.
Yeah, I mean, I was very aware of crypto when it came up in the early 10s, because my friends were using it to buy drugs. That was the first time Bitcoin came up for me. And then when I started to talk to technologists, as I started to become more embedded with my own artistic research in technologist communities, I get to know founders of companies. They were talking about Bitcoin a lot. And there were stories about how transformative it could be in so many different ways at that time. And so right at that moment, I started to pay attention to artists who were experimenting with that as a new way of working, right? So there were people attaching Bitcoin, they would attach a JPEG to a Bitcoin token and say, hey, this is a linked item, and you can track this and sell it. It's sort of proto-NFT. But it was very, very small, and hardly any people understood it. And then I kind of a few more people kind of came in successive hype waves. Crypto, like technology often does, grows in huge waves of hype, and people are super interested for a couple of months or a year, and valuations go through the ceiling, and then they crash again, and everybody looks stupid who even tried to participate before. And kind of artistic involvement in crypto also did that. So in the kind of second wave of crypto around 2018, some people I met were really interesting in the way they were working with crypto. So I met a group called Terra Zero, who were working with trying to give forests their own economy by making them autonomous in the fact that you could kind of have an automated contract that said that the trees own their own income if they were felled down. So an industrial forest could own its own kind of earnings.
That's
and
buzzy.
I thought that was a really great idea. And then, some other more kind of game-like applications were coming up. This thing called CryptoPunks and CryptoKitties, these kind of emerged, which were kind of early experiments, actually free to mint, but then like collectibles, kind of gathered value very quickly. And with CryptoKitties, it was really funny because the programming meant that you could, if you bought two, you could make them breed, and then they would produce a third token, which was kind of their own, their offspring. So it had a Tamagotchi.
And it wasn't as valuable, but the whole cultures that developed around them seemed to someone like you to be a really interesting thing to scrutinize and participate in.
Right, and then so that happened, and it was very interesting, but still very small, right? And actually not so much money in it. And then 2020-21 happened, and that was a whole nother thing. There was this very public sale of this very expensive artwork that somebody paid a lot of money for at an auction house. The Beeple, exactly. And suddenly when the auction houses came in, everybody in the art world turned around and was like, "Hang on a minute. How many millions for what JPEGs? That's not a thing. And then there was kind of like a frenzy where a lot of people started getting on board. And so I started to do some experiments at that time. I had met one of the founders of the emergent text-to-image AI programs, the guy that would work on what became Midjourney. I met him through a friend, and he was testing his early engines. And I'd also met the person who'd worked on doing the cats for CryptoKitties. And we did a little collaboration where we tried to resurrect dead companies from the 2001 Web 1 crash and kind of rebirth them as AI-generated logos, and then people would kind of collect them, pay for them, and then be in a kind of resurrected company. And for me, I found that has an interesting tension because AI is kind of trained on the internet as we know it. So it was sort of the internet remembering itself and rebirthing itself with a new kind of consumer model or something like that. And that was my first step into kind of like making a truly NFT project,
Kia ora, ko Duncan Greive tōku ingoa. I'm just taking a little break to talk to you about a big project that we've got coming next year. It's called What's Eating Aotearoa, and it is going to be a very long-running exercise in 2024 where we look at food and what its role is in our society in a really kind of broad and multifaceted way. It's going to be deep. Like we're doing long form. We're spending a lot of time with this stuff because it is so central to our lives, and this commodity, which this country makes so much of, has become really expensive. It sort of really impacts people's lives. It's a stressor. It's also a source of joy and culture, and we have always kind of published a bunch on food. Next year, we really want to make it a huge thread that runs throughout the year. To do that is going to cost us money, and there's a huge amount of resource that goes into a project at the scale that we're envisaging. And as a result, we're doing a Pledge Me drive. It's only the second one we've ever done, and the first since 2016. And we're asking for money from our audience. So if you're a member, would love it if you could give us a bit more. If you're not, this is an awesome way to sort of support the spin-off, even if you can't do so regularly, maybe chip in here. The really cool thing is that it's not just you don't just give, you also get. There's a whole array of different kind of rewards on there, some of which are already sold out, one of which is as a podcast hosted by me, which can totally be like a corporate thing too. It's kind of a bargain if you view it that way. So basically there's a whole bunch of different rewards. They're really, really fun. They're extremely spin-off. So if you go to the spinoff.co.nz/pledge me, you'll be able to kind of see what it is we're about and what you can get for your money. I think as of writing, we're roughly 60% of the way there, but to get that last push, because the whole way Pledge Me works is you either get everything if you get to 50 grand, or you get nothing if you don't. Your if you're a regular consumer of the spin-off, you're probably sick of hearing about this, but we're going to keep talking about it because we are desperate to do this work. And as of right now, we aren't at that number. I know it's a really hard time, but if you've been sort of wavering or thinking you'll get to it, please, run, don't walk to a digital device and see if you can make a pledge to support us to do this. So that's the spinoff.co.nz/pledge me to help support What's Eating Aotearoa. Given the sort of loathing that there was for NFTs around that time, and certainly escalated subsequently, did people, who were sort of in that camp, what did they make of you sort of participating in that world?
Yeah, I think I raised suspicion on all sides, So I think the people that were really true NFT heads and, were thinking that Beeple was, showing the way forward in progressive art and there was a whole new economy emerging. Some of them got my interest, understood my kind of context-rich application of the technology, and others were like, well, this is super complicated. Why would you bother doing something like that? It's anyway not going to be so successful commercially. And I mean, that's the other thing about NFTs, that I think one of the things that people outside of that world dislike a lot is value and price are very closely aligned, right? So if something's expensive, it's good. And in the kind of previous art world, there'd been a kind of a hesitation to say that directly, right? In the museum art world, something can be cheap but still have a high lot of critical value. You can make an artwork that doesn't sell, that can never sell, maybe like an ephemeral performance, and it's considered to be valuable nonetheless. Whereas in the NFT world, if it's not financially valuable, it's really worthless. So I think I pushed a few buttons moving in that direction. Also, I think foregrounding the idea of a crash at the moment of a bubble peak was potentially not the friendliest thing to send to the community there.
Was prescient though.
Well, yeah. I mean, I saw it coming. It was bound to come. I guess everybody sees it coming, but when you're really, looking up only, it's very annoying to...
Yeah, if you're hodling.
Yeah, exactly.
So before we get too...
into the weeds, yeah.
Yeah. I wondered if you could kind of step back. I've been writing a little bit lately about the sort of existential despair some people in kind of pop music feel on some level becoming user-generated content,
right.
Economy people without ever wanting that, growing up with that in mind.
Yeah.
And that the fundamentals of the economic basis of music outside of sort of god tier artists are pretty unpleasant. Do you want to kind of just speak briefly about what the overall impact of technology has been on the art world? How's everyone doing?
Yeah. It's very much more competitive than it used to be. It's always been a very competitive field, I guess, like music. I also have to say there's, in my little world, my kind of sub-art world, there's a lot of crossover with musicians. Somebody that exists in both worlds is a project, a couple called Holly Herndon and Matt Dryhurst. They're like friends of mine, and they think about these issues in the music world and the art world a lot. And for example, they focus a lot on training sets and how people get included in AI systems or not, and can be compensated for their own creative labor in those training set worlds, and that's both as a visual artist and as a kind of a musician, right? So what happens if somebody brings out a song sounding like you? What happens if you generate something in the style of an artwork where somebody else has made the content? So they're like building projects where you can kind of track whether you've been in a training set, and you can even block training sets scraping up your data. So I think these things are front of mind for creative people, especially digitally working people. In the museum art world, I think the phenomenon has affected the way popularity and reputation grows, right? So visibility in Instagram, followers in that kind of context makes very fast, quick success stories, particularly of work that looks great on the internet, So Abstract painting had a bump. Now figurative painting has a bump. Painting's back in a really big way in terms of the economy. And also galleries are finding it harder to have those small boutique stores. There's larger galleries that have a lot of services and are able to kind of put capital behind certain artists, and they're kind of consolidating. So it's very much the winner takes it all economy is also reflected even in something that feels more offline. I think in relation to these economies that are more kind of like contingent on the internet, if that makes sense.
It does. I mean, and then let's go from going very broad. Let's go very narrow.
Yeah.
Like how are you doing? Because it seems to me, without knowing as much as I should, you do things which require a phenomenal amount of research. Some of them are almost deliberately unwieldy to the point of being, if not unsaleable, like certainly like hard to say. There's a huge amount of resource goes into the creation of them. Yet you seem to be determined to follow this path wherever it leads. Like what you're sort of fixated on this thing, which is our governing reality, but also part of it too. Like how's it going?
It's actually going pretty good. I mean, again, I forged my own path, and I think a lot of artists do along their way. They kind of find their little homes, and I have many communities and kind of many conversations that I'm a part of. I like to make big, crazy things that look really great in physical museum spaces. I really love objects. I love texture. I love color. I love, these kinds of things. I also like to make work that's informed, right? That feels like it's related to now, so that people go in and they're like, yes, this is an art gallery, but this is speaking about the contemporary experience, right? And weirdly, some of the bigger, crazier things are some of the things that do better for me commercially. Like it's some people really want ambitious things. Some big collections and big museums, that's exactly what they're after. And actually, sometimes when I kind of scale down, I think, oh, maybe I should make a painting now because that's a more kind of sane thing to do. These are the things that sometimes are a little bit more slow to move. Because I think the reason for that is that in the art world, the business model is like the high end of the luxury market, right? Like it's either a museum or an institution or a very wealthy individual paying a lot of money for one thing, right? And they want that one thing then to be amazing, right? They don't want like a okay thing. They want the best thing, So I feel like the excitement and attention you get from doing something really great, something even maybe difficult to achieve, has a kind of a sense of power that those sorts of buyers are kind of tend to be more attracted to. You know what I mean?
In terms of those sorts of buyers and thinking about individuals more than institutions, and then also the sort of tech founders who you become kind of friendly with or at the very least come to know.
Yeah.
How do they respond to the fact that your work can at times be read as a fairly trenchant critique of some aspects of what they've built their houses on, or at least made the money that's bought their houses on?
Yeah, I think this is a bit of an individual to individual thing. Sometimes I've made projects where people get very prickly and they don't like the attention and they don't appreciate the feedback. I go into making a project about a particular entrepreneur or a company because I think they're important, because I think people are experiencing things that like cultural feelings and are being generated from that source. And so I think to the right viewer, that is a sort of recognition of how important I'm taking their voice to be, let's say. So some founders and some companies are like quite interested to see somebody like me take their work seriously in a cultural field, right? Because often these people are very much in their lane. They're making new products. They're building the future. That's where they see themselves. And there's different metrics to that than cultural resonance sometimes, right? Like you can make a really powerful company and maybe it has zero cultural resonance, and maybe somebody else sets out to do that, and by accident it becomes a kind of a cultural signifier of something else. At the moment I'm working on a piece about Palmer Luckey, the former founder of Oculus Rift, who then went on to found a company called Andorol, which is named after the Lord of the Rings sword. And that's a VR defense company, right? And that's starting, even though it's kind of only has a client as the Department of Defense in the US, that's something that has kind of gathered, I think, cultural significance beyond its business significance. Do you know what I mean? And I think some people who are in that position find what I do in that way fascinating, and some of them find it really annoying, yeah.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
So let's talk about a few of the sort of companies or individuals that you have kind of played with over the years. Mm-hmm. Maybe start with our famous compatriot, Peter Thiel. Tell me what you did there and how that went.
Well, Peter's, I'd been making, when I started to make, let me start at the beginning. I think I made a show about Peter Thiel in 2017. I made it here in Auckland. And I made it for Auckland, right? So I often do shows in particular places. That's another thing about making sculpture. It's in a room in a place, right? So there's a kind of context to it. And I knew Peter's work pretty well by 2017 because, as you mentioned, I'd been looking at the context for a long time. And Peter's thoughts are very influential in business, right? They're just really, he's one of the kind of, I would say, towering intellectuals of the...
Yeah, I've read 0 to 1. It's kind of an amazing book.
Exactly.
And if you divorce everything else from him.
Right. And 0 to 1 literally was sitting on founders' tables as I visited technologists all over the world, from China to Berlin to California, whatever, So I knew of his work really well. And then, of course, this amazing thing happened where suddenly he became involved in things here because he wanted to move here, because he bought property here. He was all over the newspaper. And this is sometimes a trigger for me. Something that's already on my radar becomes something that has a resonance beyond just me being obsessed with it. So I was like, great, I'm doing this show in 2017. I'm going to make that about Peter. I'm going to make that about the resonance that it has with New Zealand. I'm going to make that about his background and his ideology. And I'm going to contrast that with some pro arguments and some kind of against arguments for his position. And so I made these board game pieces at Auckland Art Gallery. Michael has a great space where there's a kind of a downstairs, like a dungeon-y downstairs. It's in a former bank, which is also a pretty crazy building. And then a kind of more like light-filled upstairs. And in the light-filled upstairs space, I made work that responded to this book, The New Zealand Project. Is it called The New Zealand Project? By
Max Harris.
Max Harris, exactly. And that was kind of an optimistic view, looking at kind of decolonial narratives and things like this. And downstairs, I made all these amazing kind of like board game things about Peter's world. So I made a Settlers of Catan kind of custom sculpture. I made a kind of dungeon-like custom sculpture after a game called Descent. And I made a Game of Life sculpture. And those were kind of like, had little, texts in them and characters, and Peter and his friends were in there, and there was a lot of ideas around, that propagate from him. And opened that, no problem, went back home to Germany, and then a few weeks later I got a call from my gallerist, from Michael, saying, hey, crazy thing happened, Peter dropped by, and he's really into the work, and there's an opportunity to reflect on that, in a different way. And so that was interesting to me. It was very gratifying, the fact that my research had resonated with the subject matter that I'd come into contact with. But of course, I'd never really expected that to happen, and I also, it left me with some questions at the same time.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, he's a really fascinating one of these. The small handful of people who feel like kind of comic book villains who walk among us, but also shape our world in pretty profound ways. And you can't. They do also resist being overly reduced. Another one, which is very relevant to us, is Kim.com. Slightly predates that. Yeah. Still rattling around. Toby Manhire was just the my colleague at the spin-off was saying he just got an email from Kim and that he's getting quite conspiratorial, which is obviously a very quite a predictable situation. Tell me about your relationship there.
Similar thing, yeah. It's so a couple of years earlier, 2013, I think I heard about I think it's 12. His thing started, right?
Yeah,
and
saga.
I was already overseas, and I was watching a lot of content on his platform. I was really using Mega like crazy, because you couldn't get Netflix at that stage. Big consumer of content. It was the only way to do it. And then again, it hit the press that the guy who founded that company that I was using every day was, in this very spectacular arrest in Auckland. I was like, well, this is too good to be true. So I looked at the indictment list. I often work from documents. I get really inspired by documents.
And you go a few layers deeper than like a typical kind of news journalist would even encounter.
I mean, I love news journalists actually because they often lead me to like little nuggets that I can start with. I'm always looking for like a relic that has some kind of tension to it. And actually, I followed this incredible Wired article that was a deep dive into Kim after that happened, and that led me to this. Also the Herald reporting at the time was amazing, I have to say.
David Fisher.
Yeah, that was amazing. And he was so present in the media here. It was just like, I actually collected the newspapers and made little paintings on them every day.
It was super accessible. I've been to his house. A lot of any journalist who wanted to go to his house in a particular era was going to his house.
That's amazing. Anyway, so I eventually found the indictment list of stuff that they took off him in the arrest. And I was like, wow, this reads like a kind of a list of incredible objects. It's almost like the court system had curated Kim's collection. And I was like, bang, there's an idea, like I want to see that show,
Yeah.
So I made these kind of knockoff versions of his collection where I kind of borrowed, bought and stealed like every kind of version that I could to try and always present everything on that list, and there were like 60 bank accounts. I opened some fake bank accounts. I printed out some documents. He had a lot of cars. I often borrowed cars from local dealerships where I would make these exhibitions. He had artists that he collected which were named. I borrowed from those artists as well, like other works that I could get my hands on. It was really a weird thing, but an incredible thing to do. And every time I walked into an iteration of this show, I was like, wow, this says something about culture, as well as about New Zealand, as well as about technology. And I kind of felt I was making the kind of low-quality streaming versions of his collection.
I was about to say, it feels like a degraded JPEG.
Yeah, exactly. So that was the core of that. And again, at the time, I made a version of that in Wellington. So I made it at the University Gallery in Wellington. And at the time, I think Michael again reached out to Kim's people and said, "Hey, this is happening." Kim was keen to keep his distance at that time.
Interesting.
Yeah,
he wasn't very Kim.
So again, he wasn't keen to get involved in that. So again, Peter was really interested. Kim was not.
Well, that sort of actually leads naturally into another sort of thing I'm curious to talk about, because part of his desire for distance at that time might have been the sort of general legal status of this kind of
possibly
case that he was wrapped up in. You're also, when you're making these works, you've worked with a lot, with Amazon and kind of some of its, future plans that never quite came off, potentially, thankfully. But fundamentally, there's incredibly wealthy people, often super vain and used to having a huge amount of control over their image, and you're using some of their stuff, and we'll talk more about that with your new work, Optimism, to kind of say things about them that they might not like. Has there been litigation? How is the legal kind of status of what you do kind of run?
Good point. I mean, there has only ever been one kind of concrete issue that I've had, and that was around that time, actually. And it's a complicated one because I made a show about Samsung in 2014, and I read a Bloomberg article, a fantastic Bloomberg article about the training process for executives at Samsung and the history of their kind of core narrative. And I was super inspired by that. It was a show that was in Frankfurt, and Samsung in the mid-90s declared a kind of more serious move towards the global market by making a declaration, kind of like a declaration of war, called the Frankfurt Declaration. And the CEO at the time flew all of his executives from Korea to Frankfurt, and kind of like had this Frankfurt Declaration. And they then made a kind of a replica of the hotel room that they made the declaration in back in Korea. And I was like, well, this is such an amazing object. I want to see that, and I want to make a version of that. So I made my own Frankfurt Declaration room at a museum in Frankfurt. And because the Samsung family actually collect, so they're big in the art world. They have actually kind of quite a serious private museum in Korea. I reached out through friends and said, hey, can I have access to this executive training facility? I'd love to see what this room actually looks like. I got a very hard no with that request. And then I got a cease and desist. And then I engaged my first intellectual property lawyer and said, like, hey, what are the risks of doing this? Like, am I really going to have a problem if I make this exhibition? And the intellectual property lawyer gave me two kind of like tips, which I've since then gone by. What would the narrative be for Samsung if they sued you? Which would be, we perceived together that would generally be negative, that they wouldn't want to draw attention to the thing more than it already existed. So that would be making them more unlikely to sue me because it would come a story by them doing it. And also, were they likely to be able to get anything that they wanted out of me other than that, like money, for example? And obviously, Samsung is a multinational, very wealthy corporation. I was a young artist, not exactly starving, but also I didn't have a huge buffer back then. So we assessed it low risk. A couple of very Samsung senior dudes looked like they came to the opening of that show. And one of my friends who was working with me on the project, who is also South Korean, spoke to them in Korean and said, like, hey, what do you guys think of the show? And they said they were confused and then left. You know,
I mean, that's a win.
Yeah, for me that was a win. Yeah.
That's really interesting. Even as you speak, it sort of points to some of the similarities between art and journalism. You know, we've got this kind of fair use and commentary type protections, which are analogous to
Right.
some of those which you operate under. I guess let's actually talk about optimism, its foundations, its intentions, and what's it all about?
So I'm making a show which opens on Friday, the 1st of December, at the Auckland Art Gallery, which is a new commission, and it's a big thing for me. I did the New Zealand Pavilion for Venice last. This is the next biggest thing I've done here, and it's inspired by the prominence of the emerging space industry in New Zealand. I often look for things that are reaching a kind of cultural peak in terms of business. And I've been watching Rocket Lab for a long time. I think they're a really, really interesting company culturally. And I think just this week with the change of government, there's been a space minister.
That's correct.
And I understand that it's a growth industry in New Zealand. It sort of reminded me of the kind of film moment with Lord of the Rings, where a kind of conflation of kind of national interests and hopes comes with a new economy in a way. And a lot of kind of popular support, but also a lot of government backing for an industry. So I've been looking at making something about Rocket Lab because I think it's a really, truly outstanding company. And I'd been looking into their patents. That's one place I look. So I told you, Kim.com, I looked at his kind of lawsuit. That was an interesting kind of relic that I found in there. I've made a bunch of sculptures that you alluded to also after patent designs, because I think patents are really interesting things. They're particularly technology companies patent a lot of any idea they might have in the future, because it becomes property that they can...
Potential future paths are revealed through patent.
Exactly, because it's kind of weirdly open source, right? You can claim ownership over an idea by making it public. And so I often look at companies' patents when I'm looking at them, and I found some amazing objects that have been patented by Peter Beck and later Rocket Labs. And they were just parts of fuel systems, so kind of technical things, but the drawings of them looked to me like flying saucers. They were very evocative of space megastructures that I'd kind of seen. I'm a big fan of NASA and kind of NASA's work in the 1960s, and there are these evocative drawings that were produced by artists like Don Davis in the 1960s and 70s for NASA, imagining space colonies. And there's a kind of form called an O'Neill cylinder, which is like a donut-shaped thing that spins and then kind of creates a sort of an artificial gravity by spinning. And then you have these amazing kind of curving landscapes inside them, which are very spectacular when they're illustrated, and I think captured the minds of many, many people over many decades already. And I thought, wow, these objects look like they could have those O'Neill cylinders inside them. And I was like, I'm going to make sculptures after these drawings of these objects, and I'm going to hang them in this giant atrium in the Auckland Art Gallery as if they're kind of flying saucers. And then I'm going to build an augmented reality app in which you can look at the kind of exploded, expanded objects, and you can see different settler groups living in kind of space colonies on these engine parts, basically. So that's the idea. I was thinking a lot about tensions around people building the future. I'm really interested in a number of companies. One of the companies I'm really interested in at the moment is a venture capital company called Andreessen Horowitz. They're one of the biggest investors in technology in California. And they recently published a manifesto on optimism, an optimist manifesto.
Which could be sort of read as a critique of the way that technology is being covered and considered by the balance of society in a way.
I think from my understanding, people that make companies like that are not very happy with the media. They really don't like the New York Times. They really don't. They feel they get a hard deal.
Well, and I think some of that is a correction to the fact that there was such kind of ill-considered coverage of the likes of Facebook in the early years, and it just the same way as like we didn't know what to do with Trump in 2016. Right. There is a sort of a correction, potentially an overcorrection. Like you have to be open to that idea,
right?
But and then you've seen them. A16Z, Andreessen Horowitz tried to build a media company called Future, which has now been shut down because it's a hard business.
It's a hard business, yeah.
Yeah. So all this is bottled up in the show.
Exactly. So I named it kind of in the spirit of that optimism. I thought also optimism about living in the future, space is a bit of a trope with a certain kind of founder, Elon Musk, Jeff Bezos, these very visible founders often talk about living off-world, going beyond a planetary species.
And it feels also connected to, and this is where Peter Thiel comes in, like the sort of seasteading movement. There's this idea that we are overly constrained and that when you go into another galaxy, you kind of slough some of that off and optimize purely.
Exactly. And kind of secessionist movements in general are also very present in those communities. This summer, for example, spent some time at a place called Zuzalu, which was a village that was taken over, a kind of private village that was taken over by Vitalik Buterin, the founder of Ethereum.
Ethereum, yeah.
Co-founder. And he sort of, made space for a number of people to come and visit. There was also a strong contingent of people in the decentralized science movement, and basically about dreaming up new states, new ways where you can make jurisdictions outside of the existing ones, so you can experiment in ways that are not restricted by state regulations. And that's kind of it's a mainstay for that conversation. I mean, Bitcoin itself, right, is a sort of extra national currency, right? That was one of the things I was always attracted to about the internet. Actually, myself being a migrant, living in another country, I feel German but not. I feel New Zealand but not. I also come from a country which was settled and has a whole lot of unresolved issues around settlement. So I felt the idea of being an international person was really compelling to me. Like I like the idea of not being bound into a nation state formation, and so I also had sympathies with these kind of secessionist ideas in a way. But yeah, the space has become one kind of giant receptacle for all those fantasies, right? And there's also interesting cultural histories that go all the way back to kind of countercultural movements in the US. The hippies famously also left their society and kind of started private, societies.
New Zealand had a huge history of communes in the sort of 70s and 80s, some of which ended really badly.
State-funded, actually, interestingly. Yeah, at times. So there's a whole kind of history of dreaming of other worlds, right? And I think space is one of those things that kind of captures that sentiment, which is, on the one hand, technological, but also very much cultural, I think,
Yeah, while you're talking, I'm also kind of imagining that this kind of ambivalent, interested, potentially even kind of, certainly open, let's put it that way, perspective on Rocket Lab, which is a company that, our reporting has pointed to their close ties with like Lockheed Martin and the U.S. Department of Defense. The idea of something that can be read as if not a celebration, that it certainly can be read admiringly about this kind of this company, which a lot of people have pretty particular opinions on, happening in the Auckland Art Gallery, a space which is more typically associated with a very different worldview. Has there been any kind of rumblings, or are you anticipating that there might be some kind of prickliness about what you're doing and where you're doing it?
I mean, I hope not. I think something like Rocket Lab is something to consider culturally. This is what I mean, and I think that my favorite art deals with the contemporary world and how it feels. And so I think the Auckland Art Gallery is like a perfect venue for us to kind of be able to take kind of Rocket Lab out of the space of like a business world and business coverage and think about it as a kind of cultural signifier. You know what I mean? And so, I hope that people come in there, they see these objects, they're copies of patterns, which I think is also really interesting. So they're about property in a way, and thinking about who owns what. There's different visions in this AR for different worlds, and some of those worlds I think will feel close to some people and others will feel more distant from them. But I guess the proposition is that one can design lots of different kinds of worlds, and I think there's a lot of discussion in the cultural sphere in New Zealand about what kind of culture we should be supporting, what has a kind of legitimacy. And so I think hopefully it could be a capture for that type of conversation as well. And I think it's a kind of a service that I can try and reframe some of the energy that goes into both the kind of dedication to building very successful, interesting businesses like Rocket Lab and kind of capturing some of the tensions around what that touches societally. You know what I mean?
I do. I really enjoyed this conversation, but I have to bring it to an end. I wondered if we could sort of finish on something where I'm curious about to get a perspective from you, and that I really enjoy the sort of and think it's almost the only way to kind of properly conceive of technology is with a level of ambivalence. But equally, if you look longitudinally against some sort of set of KPIs for our society, some of them don't feel that great right now. Yeah. And I can't. It's always hard to disentangle your own personal feelings from what a dispassionate assessment of society, if such a thing were possible, where that would get you. But I'm feeling a little doomy. And some of it I feel is that because basically technology, my general theory of it, is that it came along during at a time. This particular form of technology came along in the aftermath of the 80s, which was this great period of deregulation and a sort of suspicion of any kind of restraint on sort of private corporations. And as a result, those two things, which was almost an accident of history, it's meant that the regulatory impulse, which had existed through, we've sort of throughout, our sort of the 20th century, we would sort of, something would get a little bit out of whack and we'd put a law in. It wouldn't always be perfect, but that was the general idea, was that we would just try and muddle along to somewhere that felt like it kept certain things in tension that don't feel like they've been in tension. In fact, it feels like we have just been sort of passive recipients of whatever technologists built over the past 30 or so years. And because of the pace and velocity at which it moves, and because of how complex it is, your lawmakers are really, who are also operating in that environment, in the world that technology built, really struggle to know how to behave towards it. You're seeing little seeds of that changing with sort of Lena Khan in the US and with the EU's kind of approach to regulation. But do you believe it's a problem, this kind of regulatory void, and B, what's your sense of where this is heading or ends?
Yeah, great questions. I mean, I live in the EU, one of the most kind of regulatory friendly legal environments, I think, globally for technology. Like the EU Parliament spent a lot of time trying to figure out what they should restrict. And I'm sad to say that they often get it kind of wrong.
Yeah,
you know?
I agree.
And that's really, but it's a tough job. I mean, you've identified exactly the problem, right? The people who build it know best in some ways what it's going to do, and other people have to kind of play catch up. And there's a kind of there's a business sense to that because you make money off knowing more than other people, right? That's kind of like a basic business strategy. But then it's also, I think also people building things often don't want to disrupt things in a bad way. They want society to continue as well. And I think Sam Altman is a really interesting example of this, right? Where he is sort of seemingly on the one hand building something, but is also very hesitant about it, has been worried about what AI can do to society, jobs, et cetera, and in the US courts, And
the connection between him and Sam Bankman-Fried and the effective altruism movement feels like the classic kind of territory you explore as well.
Yeah, very, very cozy. I mean, I guess at a zoomed out answer for myself, I guess I always have to ask myself, would I rather exist in a world with, the consumer tech and the internet that I experience now or not? And I often come up with that I would rather exist in a world with the internet. I think I don't think there's ways to kind of do an objective check and balance on those types of developments. And I also think that it's very hard to stop, even if we didn't want them. So even if you had a kind of fully tuned regulatory environment, you still couldn't anticipate some of the kind of challenges that come up with building new technologies and reframing the environment. And I think that it's also, it's also kind of a human thing. The world is a dynamic place. Life has changed. If you listen to those conservative voices who are at the helm of building those things, people like Mark Andreessen, they say, how do you say, well, we want fire, but we don't want AI? I mean, it's sort of a you can pick holes in that argument as well, but in some ways, I can follow. Right? How do you know what something's going to be until you've made it?
That's right. Which I totally get. There's just a sense that to regulate at all at times is an impulse that should be restrained, which. Yeah, I don't know. It's a complicated one, but look, I've so enjoyed this conversation. I'm really looking forward to seeing the work. Thank you so much for coming up here, Simon.
Thank you, Duncan. I'm such a fan of the spin-off, fan of your work. So it's a long-time list of first-time caller situation. Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you. That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today. The Spin-off Podcast Network.